Hello, you're all very welcome today to Carlow County Council's Decade of Centenary video series, brought to you by Carlow Libraries and Carlow County Museum. During this series of videos, we will present to our viewers discussions and insights into the stories, events and history of the turbulent times over a century ago, and hopefully provide our audience with a better understanding and appreciation of those momentous events that formed our new state. My name is Christopher Power, and today I'm joined by Dr Shay Kinsella in the historic surrounds here of Carlow County Museum. Now, Shay is currently working on the Carlow volume of the Irish Revolutions series, which has been published by Four Courts Press, so he has an in-depth knowledge of this subject. And I suppose I'd lead into ask Shay about Carlow generally during the period of independence, in terms of at the start of the War of Independence, how was County Carlow in terms of unrest and how it would have compared to other counties in general?
Thanks, Christopher. Delighted to be asked to participate in this great series. It's great to see Carlow represented. And when I was first approached to write the Carlow volume for this series, I was delighted because it was a book that I wanted to read. It was a topic that, you would hear mentioned in backgrounds and funerals and parties, and you hear about the revolution in Carlow. But I wanted to get into the in-depth nitty-gritty of what actually did happen in Carlow. And in terms of the War of Independence, then Carlow would have been obviously one of the Leinster counties, which is regarded as the least active of the four provinces. In terms of fatalities and in terms of incidents and actions taken by the IRA. So I wanted to look at why was Carlow regarded as a quiet county, and it was. And it was regarded as such by not just people within Carlow, but on a national level as well. I mean, you had figures like General J.J. O'Connell, Ginger O'Connell from IRA GHQ, and in his opinion, Carlow was greatly lacking in national spirit. And that's a direct quote from General O'Connell. And then even in terms of the Carlow IRA themselves, the leadership themselves were very, there was a lack of energy evident in the county and a lack of enthusiasm for the national movement. And the OC of the Carlow Brigade in 1920, he described Carlow as largely a Sean-Een area. Now, Sean-Een was a contemporary term for a West Brit, okay, and somebody who was imitating English systems and English ways rather than being Irish Ireland. So yeah, that was his opinion. The Carlow was largely a Sean-Een area, and he was describing in his military pension application how he was finding it almost impossible to keep a spark alive. So as the brigade OC, his attention wasn't on active engagement against the enemy. It was about keeping this spark alive within Carlow, which he said was almost an impossible task. Okay. Another one of his colleagues then was Gearóid O'Sullivan, who was a teacher out in Knockbeg. He was a cousin of Michael Collins from West Cork. Obviously used to the rebel attitude down in West Cork, and he came up to Carlow and he was flabbergasted by the lack of enthusiasm and the general apathy among the population for a national movement and activism in that cause. And in his own words, he said it almost broke his heart trying to organise within Carlow in around 1917 up to 1920. You have another quote then from a man called Michael Dourley. He went on to become the OC of Nerney, and he said that the men involved in setting up the IRA in Carlow in the early days had hearts of steel because the job would have been easier in Belfast. Okay. So quotes like that just give you some indication of how tough the job was in Carlow at the time, how the movement greatly struggled to get on its feet, and that certainly accounts for a lot of the quiet county label that has been put on the county up to 1920. Okay.
Just in relation to that, I suppose, would this be attributable? Carlow has a reputation of having had a high degree of landed families, and what bearing would you think that had on the general attitude of the county? I mean, it must have had a profound effect on the nationalist movement.
Absolutely, and it did, and that's what I'm currently working on, is to find out the exact details of how that infrastructure worked on kind of keeping a lid on nationalist movements within the county. But yeah, Carlow has the reputation of being, the most gentrified county in Ireland, and certainly there were several landed estates across the county. They were a very significant employer, and my reading of it at the moment is that people almost didn't want to bite the hand that fed it.
Okay.
And there was these inherited attitudes then of, deference towards the gentry. I mean, in 1916, 1917, there was still the tradition of artistic memorials being presented to families when the heir of a family married, or when the heir to a landed estate turned 21. These kind of shows of deference and respect towards the land of families, they were still very much in place in Carlow. And as well as that, you didn't want to, if you were, in terms of your economic well-being, you weren't going to bite the hand that fed it in terms of actively pursuing your landlord or your employer on political issues at that time. So there was also a phrase at the time that the bees of Carlow carry a sting. And this was a reference to the number of landed families in the county whose surname began with the letter B.
Oh yes, of course.
And so that was a centuries-old phrase, the bees of Carlow carry a sting. But it was still being referred to in newspapers at the time that, the people in Carlow are a little bit almost afraid or overly deferential towards their political and their landed overlords.
Okay, very good. So Shay, in terms of the events that did happen in the county, at what period did some of the more general, I suppose, violent incidents that occurred in so much of the country occur in Carlow?
Well, I suppose, Christopher, would be around the end of 1920, and there was a lot of reasons for that. Around August, September 1920, the leadership within the Carlow Brigade said that things were at their lowest ebb. Things were not going well at all. One of them said it was actually in a desperate situation and something needed to change. And this seems to have been precipitated by a general order from GHQ IRA in Dublin that the RIC personnel were legitimate targets for attack and possible assassination at that stage. Now, this seemed to create a lot of consternation within the Carlow Brigade. Like the RIC in Carlow had a very healthy reputation up to that point with the general community. They were very well respected. They had integrated hugely with the local communities. For example, you have a constable in Carlow called Timothy Brennan, and he was from Roscommon. He had been in Carlow since 1911, and he was now a member of Carlow rugby team. He was a member of society. He was a local boxer, a local athlete, very well respected, very well known. And he regretted the increased militarisation of the RIC at this stage, and he had a real problem with that. The fact that the RIC were being asked now to go out on military patrols, the fact that they were being asked to carry weapons. So he was one of the local RIC men who had a problem with this. And he decided to take action, and he began writing to some of his comrades across stations across the province. Right. And he was looking to bring it up with the management, with the RIC management in Dublin, who obviously had a great problem with this. And eventually he was dismissed in August 1920. So this was kind of an indication of the growing dissonance between the RIC as members of the community and the community itself. Another incident happened then. It would have been a meeting of the unionists within Carlow. It was the magistrates, which was essentially a unionist meeting at that stage. You had figures like Lord Rathdonnell of Lisnavagh, who was a representative peer. You had Henry Brune of Oak Park. You had Dennis Pack-Beresford of Fenagh, who had been threatened with assassination by the IRA the previous month. But they got together and they had witnessed within the community and within the county at large that there was a general disfeeling of dissatisfaction with the British rule. And these magistrates got together in a meeting and they prepared a memorial for Lloyd George as Prime Minister, telling him that, in their opinion, as the magistrates of the county, that there was a complete breakdown in law and order within Carlow, and that they were advising Lloyd George to hand over governance of the county to the Irish people, as they phrased it, as soon as possible. Right. Now, this is at complete odds with how the IRA were feeling within themselves. And what brought things to a head within the IRA was their problem with the potential assassination of the RIC. General Headquarters then enforced the resignations of a lot of these officers, and they were replaced then by officers from outside the county. So you had this influx of leadership from men from outside the county, men like Lawrence O'Neill from County Tipperary. You had Eamon Malone, who was from Athy. He became the OC of Carlow Brigade. Thomas O'Connell from Edenderry became the Vice OC. He had Liam Stack, who was a Listowel man from County Kerry. He became the intelligence officer. So it was almost like a takeover from outside Carlow of the Carlow Brigade, and that things were put on a proper footing at that stage. And a lot of the old officers then either melted back into their battalions or were sent to other counties altogether.
Okay, yeah, very good. So Shay, from that period, there was an escalation in the incidents that were to occur in the county. Can you tell us a bit about those various violent incidents that occurred thereafter?
Certainly. Well, when these new officers took over Carlow Brigade, there was a definite expectation and a knowledge on their part that General Headquarters would expect action from this newly formed brigade. And so Lawrence O'Neill, he was the OC of the 1st Battalion. He came up with the brainchild of setting up a Carlow Active Service Unit, a flying column. Now initially he wanted to operate it just within the 1st Battalion, and if that worked well, then they'd extend it across the 6 battalions of the Carlow Brigade. So he set about putting together this brigade of active, efficient, dedicated young men who would be able to fly across the 1st Battalion area. From December 1920 then up to January 1921, February 1921, O'Neill with the brigade staff put together this group of 12, 13 dedicated mostly local men. Some of the men came from the town itself, some of them from Escalation, others were emigrants into Carlow, and some of them actually had older brothers that had been killed within the First World War. There was a man, William McKenna, from Carlow town. His family had moved down from Tyrone, and they were some of the most militant of the nationalists within Carlow at that time. The average age of the active service unit was about 22 years of age, all Catholic, and they were being trained in 2 primary areas. So it was in the hilly hinterland of Escalation in the northwest of the county, and then down south on the flanks of the Blackstairs Mountains. So those were their 2 training grounds. And they were working very well, they were gaining in confidence, and that's when the British military authorities and the Crown Forces decided to pursue this active service unit across the county. So in the first 3 or 4 months of 1921, you're seeing an increased and dogged and determined pursuit of the active service unit within Carlow, directed primarily from Carlow Military Barracks here in the town itself.
Okay. So Shay, in terms of these incidents, would they have occurred mostly in the hinterland of Carlow or around Carlow town or in the more rural areas?
Mostly in the rural areas. In fact, almost certainly always in the rural areas. So you were talking about the area around Escalation and then down at the Blackstairs Mountains in the south of the county. The active service unit had an arms dump up in Escalation, and was also where 2 members of the column were actually from Escalation. So they were very familiar with that territory. It was good guerrilla territory in terms of the topography of the land. So that's where they were most comfortable, and that's where they did a lot of their training. So when the detachments then were sent out by Carlow military from the military barracks, those were the 2 primary areas where they led their convoys of Crosley tenders up to Escalation or down south towards Ballymurphy and Rahana. So on the 3rd of March 1921, a detachment of the North Staffordshire Regiment left Carlow Barracks, and they had received information that the active service unit, the flying column, attended Mass every Sunday in Rahana in the south of the county. So they went with a party of 12 in a Crosley tender down towards the church in Rahana. Their objective was to check if the Mass goers included members of the IRA who were armed. They didn't want to create panic, so they set up a roadblock about a half a mile outside the village. Now, unfortunately, when the mass goers came out of the church and they saw the military waiting, there was some panic, and a lot of them began to disperse and went up hilly sideways and up byways and laneways. Okay. And one of those men was James Hayden. He was a 35-year-old farmer living with his widowed mother and his brother. And unfortunately, when he was called to halt by one of the soldiers of the North Staffordshire Regiment, he disobeyed the call. Now, listening to the testimony at the Court of Inquiry, it seems that he had been called to halt against the wind. So the wind was blowing away from the soldier. So the likelihood is, and this was admitted in the court, that James Hayden didn't even hear the call to halt, and he was shot dead by an overzealous and young member of the North Staffordshire Regiment. The British military authorities called a regrettable episode. They said it was unnecessary, but what they did ask the public to take account of was the sense within the military in Carlow at the time that they were under attack, and I suppose that was some excuse towards their heightened trigger-happy state at that stage.
Okay, yeah. So this is what, so he was one of the first victims. And events went from there, I take it, throughout March 1921 to other incidents.
Absolutely. Well, actually, the flying column were very lucky on that incident where James Hayden lost his life, because they were only billeted a mile away from Rahana Chapel at that stage. So the military were closing in, and they eventually did catch up with them then on the following month, on the 18th of April 1921, when the British military successfully ambushed the flying column in a place called Mullanagown, just outside Ballymurphy village, at about 1 o'clock in the afternoon that day.
Okay, which is very interesting, because I mean the countryside you're describing, yeah, and you use the term guerrilla warfare. I mean, it is very rural. It's even now it would feel quite far removed from anywhere, and that it's interesting that there was so much activity in that part of the world that would have been relatively sparsely populated. So the suggestion would be, I suppose, that there was probably possibly inside information as to what the local IRA were doing or where they were drilling, and that, I assume.
Absolutely, and there is a big urban-rural divide within the community at this stage. Like, Carlow Town was very anti-IRA, or gave as little help as possible compared to the more rural parts of the county, where areas like Ballymurphy, where the local units of their area said they had every man to a T was on their side down in that part of the country. And the likelihood of information being passed is quite high. Lieutenant Grundy, who led the British escort or party that day, he said that they were acting on information. That's what brought them down to the south of the county. So they left Carlow Barracks at 6:30 that morning, and they were trailing around that general area of Borris and Clashganny, and eventually they caught up with the brigade, the active service unit in Ballymurphy at 1 o'clock. Completely unexpectedly, they said that the two Crosley tenders were driving north towards Ballymurphy village and observed the flying column drilling in the field. Okay. And so the 11 members of the flying column were actively drilling. They were preparing for a visit from an officer from General Headquarters, Simon Donnelly. He was coming down to give them a G up and a bit of enthusiasm, and give them some advice as well on their training procedures. So their complete attention was focused on the inspection that was coming that afternoon. Okay. They made a fatal error not posting any scouts. Right. And the Vice OC of the brigade, Tommy O'Connell, he did get a lot of slack following the ambush for failing to foresee this eventuality. Okay. So, without a doubt, Christopher, the ambush at Ballymurphy was the most devastating episode for IRA fortunes in the county throughout the whole of the War of Independence. I mean, 8 of the flying column were arrested that day. 1 was fatally shot, Michael Fay, a young 22-year-old, and their whole arsenal of weaponry was taken by the British that day. So you're talking about 11 rifles, 5 revolvers, a double-barrel shotgun, 500 rounds of ammunition. And for a small county who was finding it difficult to get arms, this was completely devastating. Sure, and yeah. When Eamon Malone, the OC of the brigade, heard about the attack at the ambush at Ballymurphy, he is reputed to have exclaimed, "My God, this is nearly the end." So in terms of his morale at this stage, he was almost through as well. So it was completely devastating. Tommy O'Connell, who was the OC of the brigade, he was also on the column, but he was away that day. He was gone to help the man from GHQ to get to Ballymurphy. So when he came back to Ballymurphy that evening, he saw his whole unit, he heard his whole unit had been either taken or killed. So it must have been devastating for him as well. So morale was at a complete low at that stage. Just when they felt they were on the up, when they were getting things organised and when they were ready for offensive action, they were annihilated. And on the other side then, the British, of course, were euphoric. This was a massive, massive coup for them. Sir General Neville Macready, the Commander-in-Chief of British Forces in Ireland, he sent a telegram of congratulations to Carlow Military Barracks at their success. And Lieutenant Grundy of the North Staffordshire, he was awarded an MBE by the King that June for his services in Ballymurphy, which he continued to sport for the rest of his life at military reunions in England. Right, okay. That is. In terms of the general fatalities, I mean, I understand there were more than just military fatalities in the Ballymurphy ambush. Yes, and that's one of the most sad and tragic aspects of that. There were 3 non-combatant fatalities that day. the two brothers were busy out in their father's field working after their midday lunch or dinner. And when they returned, they were as surprised as the active service unit were when the shots started being fired from the road. And their natural instinct was to run away from the line of fire. Now, this was taken as an admission from the British Crown Forces that these were actively engaged in the column. They were pursued by the military or a black and tan contingent, it's hard to tell, but they were shot dead, and their family were adamant then that they were bayoneted viciously. And that's actually inscribed on the headstone by the family, that they were bayoneted. So that gives you some indication of how hot things got and how vicious things became in the heat of battle in Ballymurphy. Sure. There was another third fatality that day, a non-combatant fatality. His name was John Ryan. He was a 62-year-old deaf farmer, and the Court of Inquiry alleges that when the shooting took place that he was in his farmyard and that he had stood up on a ledge behind a farm wall to observe what was going on in the field, and he was shot in the face. Now the family dispute that, and they allege that the position in which his body had been found wouldn't tally with him standing up on a wall. So the implication there is that he was deliberately targeted by one of the Crown Forces within his own farmyard. So yeah, 3 non-combatant fatalities that day, along with Michael Fay, who was the only fatality on the column itself. Completely devastating blow for the local community, but for the Carlow nationalist movement as a whole, had tragic consequences. Not eased by the reaction the following days by the British authorities, who came out to the funerals of the 3 local men, the 2 Farrell brothers and John Ryan, and proceeded to hold a court of inquiry in the churchyard itself, insisting that the coffins be opened in front of the families so that the bodies could be identified. And this greatly raised the hackles, obviously and understandably, of the local communities. A horrific thing to have gone through, but wasn't aided by the behaviour of the British forces at the time. And that still rankles in living memory and folk memory down in Ballymurphy to this day.
Sure, as it would, insensitive fact that it was. And I understand that there's 2 very nice memorials to the Farrells and to John Ryan in there where they died.
Absolutely.
Which are very, which are held in pride of place, yeah. What was the general fallout of Ballymurphy? Obviously there were repercussions across the board, but in the days that followed, was there recrimination for it? Absolutely.
Well, the brigade staff were held to account as to how this could have happened. And as I say, for the next few years, the Vice OC of the Carlow Brigade, Tommy O'Connell, who was a member of the Flying Column that day, he was held to account as to how this could have happened and why scouts weren't posted and why provisions weren't made to protect the column while they were training that day. And I suppose the automatic reaction is to point the finger at somebody. So rumours began to circulate, and information was sought as to possible informants to the British who gave away the location of the column that day. If you look at the Bureau of Military History testimonies from Carlow witnesses, they mention an informant or a spy called Finn, and this occurs in 2 or 3 of the witness statements. So this man called Finn was apparently abducted then by the Carlow Brigade, held to account for informing on the active service unit, and was executed. Now, when I began digging a little deeper, I couldn't find any account of a Finn being killed. There were plenty of Finn families in Carlow at the time. There was one in Bagnestown, but I couldn't pinpoint a fatality. And even within the other available sources, I couldn't track down the execution of a man called Finn. But I did track down the execution of a man called Michael Hackett. He was from Bagnestown. He was a 27-year-old ex-soldier. And if you track Michael Hackett on the 1911 census, you see that he can't read or write. So he could possibly have had an intellectual disability. He might have had a learning disability. He might have been a vulnerable and easily approachable person that the Black and Tans or the RAC could have got on side in terms of informing.
Yes.
But he became a person of interest to the Carlow Brigade after Ballymurphy. So within a fortnight of Ballymurphy, they had held a court-martial in Hackett's absence, and they had found him directly responsible for giving away the flying column at Ballymurphy, and they were determined to pursue him. So in mid-May then, they spotted him at a field day, a sports event in Fenagh. They arrested him and kidnapped him on his bicycle, brought him to a safe house in Michael, and he was duly executed by members of the Carlow Brigade on the 1st or early June 1921. He was buried in a shallow grave. Later on, the Carlow Brigade gave evidence that he had the presence of a priest who said prayers for him, who was with him when he was executed, and that he was buried with all due respect. But as it turned out, under pressure from Free State authorities in 1922-23, the Carlow Brigade conceded that there was no priest present and that he mightn't have been treated as respectfully as they led the family to believe. Okay. And the Hackett family actually discovered the body by themselves on a mountainside near Michael in Coolnashnachta. So they were very incensed that their son had been treated in this way and that they were finding it difficult to get answers from the authorities.
Yes, okay.
So Hackett then was the only case of a disappearance by the IRA in Carlow. But there was plenty of other accusations of spies and informers, and certainly within the Unionist and the Loyalist community in Carlow, information was being passed to the RIC and to the military authorities in Carlow. But then I suppose you have the very controversial case of the shooting dead of William Kennedy and his solicitor, Michael O'Dempsey, in Borris in March 1921, allegedly as spies, but there's a lot more to that case than meets the eye. If you were to base your reading on the case primarily from the Bureau of Military History witness statements from members of the Carlow Brigade, you would say that Kennedy was definitely proactive in informing against the local IRA. And if you were to judge it just from that one source, you would get a very one-sided picture. But from local sources and from other available documentary sources, it appears it's definitely not as clean-cut as that. And when you hear that Kennedy was in fact a very ardent nationalist, it definitely changes the picture radically. His father was a Fenian. James Kennedy was a Fenian from the 1860s. It's alleged that the Kennedys were directly kinspeople of Father Murphy of 1798 fame. William Kennedy himself was very active in Home Rule politics. He was actually in Carlow in 1913 when there was a huge Home Rule rally, and he was up on the platform when John Dillon was speaking. So he was certainly a nationalist. He was definitely a hot-headed man. He was arrogant in some ways. He was stubborn, and he would be a hard man to convince of an alternate opinion to his own. So that probably didn't do him any favours in the local community. But he was very well respected down in Borris. He was a very wealthy businessman. His primary profession was as a chemist, but he also had a 9-bedroom hotel. He ran a general provisions shop, an agricultural supplies shop. He ran the Hackney service in Borris. He had a sawmill. He was the local undertaker. So he had plenty of fingers and plenty of pies, a huge employer, and a young man as well. He was only 35 years of age. And from the evidence that I have seen, it seems that he was all gung-ho for active IRA activity from 1916 onwards. But from what I can read of it, it appears that he was too aggressive and too hot-headed, and he may have been told to cool down by others within the local battalion. And he didn't appear to take this very well, and this seemed to drive a wedge between him and the IRA within Borris at the time. James Lennon, who was the TD for Carlow, said that he was a personal friend of Kennedy's, but that they distanced themselves from each other around the time of this split. Okay. So when he was approached then on the day of the funeral of Terence McSweeney to close his shop along with all the other business people in Borris, Kennedy refused. And this was the incident which got a lot of things happening in Borris which were unpleasant to say the least. So what happened in Borris after the funeral was that the local people were told to boycott Kennedy's shop. He didn't take this very well, and he took legal proceedings against 10 local people, including the local doctor and James Lennon, the TD for Carlow, that they were responsible for initiating this boycott against him. And so while these court cases were pending, the local IRA got together and they decided that Kennedy was a man that needed to be removed from the local situation. According to them, he had been informing directly with the auxiliaries, that he had accompanied auxiliaries out around Borris identifying houses of local IRA suspects. Other sources say he was seen directly firing shots into local IRA activists' houses. So there's a lot of rumour, a lot of unproven accusations at the time, but yet this was dragged up as evidence against William Kennedy, and that he was actively informing against him. He was a spy, and that he deserved the ultimate sanction, which was execution as a spy. He was being represented in court by his friend and his solicitor, Michael J. O'Dempsey, who ran a very successful practice in Enniscorthy in Wexford. And a very brave man. He had been kidnapped by the local IRA in Boris and was put under pressure to stop representing Kennedy, but he refused. And he was with Kennedy then one night in 15th of March 1921. They were coming out of Kennedy's hotel to get a breath of fresh air and go for an evening walk, and they were killed by the local IRA, who were hidden behind a wall across the road from Kennedy's hotel. Kennedy died instantly. He had a revolver, but he didn't get an opportunity to use it. And O'Dempsey then was alive when he was brought back into the hotel, but died the following day of wounds to the stomach and to the head.
Okay. And that premises was what is now actually the former Bank of Ireland in Boris, which is, so that's where the hotel was.
Absolutely. So that was the Kennedy headquarters. A very large premises. It had a shop, it had a hotel, it had a chemist, it had the post office. And, it was an awful event. There's still a lot of secrecy around it, still have a lot of ill feeling in Boris to this day, I think. A lot of unwillingness perhaps to speak about it. But if you put together a lot of the local anecdotal sources with some of the documentary sources, you get a rounded picture. But there's still a lot to be uncovered, I think, about that story. Yeah. The mother of O'Dempsey, the solicitor, was incensed that her son was never given the opportunity to defend himself. And she wrote to De Valera and she wrote to Cathal Brugha as the Minister for Defence, looking for an explanation of why her son had been branded a spy. There was placards placed on the wall in Burris at the shooting saying K and D spies killed by the IRA, beware. So she was incensed that her son hadn't been given due legal process. And eventually Cathal Brugha came back to her after initiating his own investigation, and he completely exonerated O'Dempsey, saying that he had been completely innocent of any wrongdoing against the IRA, and the mother did receive some compensation for her son's death in court. Okay. Whereas William Kennedy didn't receive the same open hearing, shall we say, and his reputation to date is tarnished by his killing as a spy in Boris in 1921.
Okay. In relation to that, Shay, you've written an article in Carlow Vienna in the 2020 edition about John Dillons' visit to Carlow, of which there's a piece of footage, a fantastic thing that has been restored, and in actual fact, Kennedy appears in that footage, but it's very difficult to actually identify him. But if there are shadowy images of him on that, if I understand.
Absolutely. So the Home Rule film that was taken by the Sylvester brothers, who ran the local cinema here in Carlow, that was taken in November 1913. And that drew the largest crowd to any nationalist meeting since maybe 1879 during the Land League days. So in the newspapers of the time, they give a list of all of the local luminaries and important people who were allowed up onto the platform with Dillon. And William Kennedy is listed in that list, as is Michael J. O'Dempsey, the solicitor who represented him. So they're there somewhere in that footage. Obviously, we can't identify them now. But yeah, it's intriguing to think that both men were up there in the cause of Carlow and Irish nationalism, but yet they were both assassinated by members of a more militant wing of that same movement 7-8 years later. Yeah,
which is quite an extraordinary thing. Yeah, so conversely then, the RIC and Crown forces in Carlow, were there casualties amongst of that contingent in the county during the period? There
were, and a look at the RIC in Carlow at that period, it's a fascinating study within itself. About 1920, Christopher, there was only about 70 members of the RIC in Carlow in total. And following the barrack burning campaign of early 1920, the RIC had retreated to the bigger towns, so Carlow Town and Bagenstown, and there was a station in Boris as well. But they were concentrated within those large urban settings, so they were less of a visible profile around the town at that stage. And the Black and Tans actually didn't arrive in Carlow as auxiliaries to the RIC until November 1920. So if you think about it, the reputation that the Black and Tans have within Ireland and within Carlow, you know, they were only really active in Carlow from November 1921 up to the truce in July 1920, November 1920 up to the truce in July 1921. So that's a period of about 8 months.
Yeah, quite a short period.
Yeah, quite a short period when you think about it. But yet they generated this reputation for themselves within those 8 months. So in terms of RIC fatalities then, Christopher, you had the shooting of 2 RIC constables in Tullow in September 1920. One of those was a man called John Gaughan. He was a man from Belmullet. He'd been stationed in Carlow from 1911. And intriguingly, he was an Irish language teacher. He had been employed by the Gaelic League in Carlow to teach Irish lessons in the local primary schools.
Oh God,
and which is intriguing in itself.
Yes.
Yeah, so he was another one of the RIC in Carlow who found it increasingly problematic for him to observe the increased militarisation of the RIC and the increased duties that they were expected to take on, which drove a wedge between them and the local community. And Gaughan had in fact, just the day before his shooting, he had actually submitted his resignation to the sergeant in charge of Tullow Barracks, and had actually arrived back from Dublin the day after his shooting. So it was a pretty tragic case.
Terrible thing, yeah.
Terrible. And, you know, he had been integrated into the local community. He was actually courting a local girl from Tullow, and he had planned to move away from the force and set up life, possibly in Carlow, who knows. But, you know, that was cut short. And as well, his colleague, Constable Delaney, was also shot dead that day. So this was this sent shockwaves throughout the local community in terms of the RIC, but also within the local nationalist community. And actually in the Court of Inquiry, or the inquest into the shooting of those 2 constables, the local members of that inquest wanted to put on record their objections to the shooting of military. So that gives you some indication of how ingrained the RIC were within the community socially, and, you know, in terms of family networks and relationships, that they were very much part of the community at that stage. Okay. There was only one Black and Tan fatality in Carlow during the War of Independence, and that was a man called James Duffy. He was 30-year-old from Monaghan. He had seen service in the Royal Garrison Artillery during World War I, and he had won a military medal for bravery during the war. He signed up for the Black and Tans then in December 1920, and he arrived in Carlow in January 1921. He was only in Carlow a couple of months, but he proved himself to be a very dogged, aggressive and determined member of that force. One of his habits was to go out in plain clothes to try and infiltrate the areas that the active service unit was known to be resident in or billeted in. So he is known to have gone into the home of the Bean brothers. There were 3 Bean brothers on the active service unit. So James Duffy, the Black and Tan, managed to find their parents' house in plain clothes. He went in and shot some bullets through the roof of the kitchen there. So he had made himself very well known to the local community, and he became of interest to the active service unit. So on the early April then, 1921, only when he'd been in Carlow maybe 2 months at this stage, he applied for evening leave from the sergeant in charge of Carlow RIC Barracks. So it's 6:30 that evening, the 3rd of April, 1921. He set out over Graig Bridge to go for a drink with a friend that he had met in Graig, Henry James, and to go out to Escalation for a drink in Fitzpatrick's pub. They went out there, had their drink. Duffy had his revolver with him in his plain clothes. But on their way back from the pub then, they observed a group of men sitting on the ditch about a mile from Fitzpatrick's pub on the road back into Carlow. And as they got closer to this group of men, they got up from the ditch and they began firing. Now, it turns out that these were members of the local Coalition IRA, and there was very possibly members of the active service unit within that firing party, because it's alleged that the Black and Tan Duffy's revolver was later given to Michael Fay, who was the fatality at Ballymurphy. So the likelihood of Fay being there on the day is quite high.
Strong then, according
quite
to that.
High, yeah. And as well as that, the wounds inflicted on Duffy's body give some indication of how assertive a message that the local IRA wished to make. He was shot 9 times. There were 2 bullets in each of his buttocks, which indicates that he was shot from behind as he was trying to escape or run away. He was shot 3 times in the face and once then in the back of the head. So that's 9 bullets in total, make it very clear that the IRA were trying to make a statement with this killing.
Okay. It's quite interesting what you're saying too, that he's not the stereotype of a black and tan, that he's obviously Irish, probably Catholic, but that the stereotype of being English ex-servicemen didn't always apply to the black and tans, so yeah.
And that's what's really important about doing the research on each individual act, to see what the exact background is of each of these, because it gives a different nuance and a different overall picture. But yeah, he was a Catholic from Tonniscoffey in Monaghan. His father was a cattle dealer, and he had come back from the war with his medal in his pocket and was looking for action, and he was determined to get some action in Carlow. The fact that he ventured out so often to the heartland of the active service unit proves that he was no shrinking violet, and he was prepared for action, and ultimately paid the price for his diligence to the crown.
Yeah. So leading on from that, about Duffy being a black and tan, and the experiences that he had previously, obviously with all this, the First World War, which Ireland which had literally just ended, that obviously had a huge impact on events in Carlow and everywhere else.
Absolutely, Christopher, and it's very important to look at the impact of First World War in Carlow. It didn't occur in a vacuum, and it did have an immediate impact on political and social events in Carlow. So it's very important to look at things in the round and see the World War as very much an active force in what came later in terms of the War of Independence. But yeah, Carlow was said to have been punching well above its weight in terms of its manpower, its contribution towards the manpower of the British forces in World War I. It also did a lot for Carlow economy in terms of land prices and in terms of agricultural provisions from County Carlow. So in a way, Carlow farmers did quite well out of the war. And that was one of the reasons in a way for the IRA and the Sinn Féin policy being quite unpopular within Carlow at the time. There seemed to be a disconnect between the agricultural community and the nationalist community in a way. They were seen as 2 separate agendas. Okay. And the fact that there had been very little, in terms of the country as a whole, there was leased land sold through the Land Acts in Carlow, so the transfer of land hadn't been completed in Carlow by a long shot. And you would imagine that would have been an impact or a driving force behind nationalist efforts. But the opposite seemed to be the case. And the same thing could be said of the World War I. The prosperity that came in its wake was welcomed by the Carlow people, and they were unwilling, I suppose, to mess with that by being seen as being disloyal, by engaging in nationalist or Sinn Féin policies and submitting to the policies of Sinn Féin.
Okay, yeah, very good. Another question, maybe just in terms of the period of Carlow. Obviously, these things don't happen in isolation, but the adjoining counties to Carlow, how were events there, and how would they have impacted on County Carlow during that period?
Well, as we said earlier, Leinster did have the least active record within the 4 provinces during the War of Independence. So a lot of the counties surrounding Carlow could as well be labelled with the tag, the quiet counties. And I know Michael Rafter has published a book about County Laois, Queen's County at the time, entitled The Quiet County. And a lot of work needs to be done about exposing why this was in fact the case. But it had a lot to do with the economic prosperity of the people, and I suppose an ingrained adherence to British rule in Ireland, this whole idea of the Pale. And Gearóid O'Sullivan said as much when he came down, or when he came from Cork and observed things in Carlow. He says, we're within the Pale now, we're close to Dublin, the centre of British rule in Ireland. So that filtered down through to the local, or to the surrounding counties to Carlow. So Wexford had its moment during 1916. It was particularly active in terms of being outside Dublin. But Laois and Kilkenny were held up as non-participants, I suppose, within the War of Independence. Okay. So the Carlow Brigade as well then was stretched into parts of Kildare, a small part of Laois, and into County Wicklow as well, and down towards the south of the county then it had cross-border relations with the Wexford Brigade.
The Anglo-Irish truce, which happened on the 11th of July 1921, was a momentous event for Ireland. And how did that impact on County Carlow?
Well, I think the overall feeling was one of immense relief, Christopher. You know, there's talks of dances being held in small towns and villages across the county. But within the IRA, then, the Carlow Brigade, certainly there was an overall sense of complete relief. This was just a couple of months after the devastation of the active service unit. And although plans were in place to create a new flying column, they hadn't got there yet. They weren't ready for active engagement. And I think the truce probably came at the perfect time for the Carlow Brigade, who hadn't managed to recoup their lost weaponry either. So it was a very opportune event. And it gave them a chance to take a break. It gave them a chance to gather themselves. And they set up a training camp then in an unoccupied landlord's house, Duckett's Grove, which was a huge rambling mansion. It was commandeered by the Carlow Brigade, and they set up a hugely successful training camp there, which saw thousands of men going through between July 1921 and the signing of the treaty in December. And they ran weaponry training, they ran signalling training, they ran first aid training, and the British took note of this, obviously at a distance because of truce regulations, but they were very disturbed by the success of the camp at Duckett's Grove. You know, the fact that it was taking prisoners, they were holding local people prisoner there who were deemed to have broken the laws. They were running armed military training, people were appearing in uniform. So at one stage in one of the documents, the truce documents, one of the local auxiliaries made a comment that this is one of the hot centres of the IRA in the country at the moment. Okay. So in a way, it was the truce where Carlow really blossomed in terms of its commitment to the nationalist cause. It's estimated that it was in the region of £4,000 that it took to run the camp for those months, which would all have been voluntary or apparently voluntary. Some would say that they were forced contributions from the local community. But there was a lot of support for the camp as well. Okay. A lot of activity going on there. And even if you look in terms of the attitude of the IRA, they start to appear in photographs. There are several photographs of the camp at Duckett's Grove, and you can see that they're relaxed and they're happy to be photographed. The tension had been taken out of the air. They were now lords of the manor. They took pride in posing on the steps of Duckett's Grove, and there's a very famous photograph of 3 Cumann members who had recently escaped from Mountjoy, who were brought down for safekeeping in Duckett's Grove, and they managed to find the Duckett family's Union Jack flag within the house, and they placed it on the steps, and they're standing in their uniforms on the Union Jack flag. So very symbolic picture that there's a new order in town here, we're in control, and it was a rest cure for a lot of the IRA at that time. So it's a period within the War of Independence and the Civil War that needs another look. I think there's a lot could be said about the Duckett's Grove camp and its success and its message to the world at large. Yeah, that's very, very good. That's very interesting. Do I understand that the statutory around Duckett's Grove was used for target practice? So it's alleged, and I mean, if you look at some of the National Library of Ireland's photographs on catalogue there, you can see that there were numerous small and large statues. So I suppose they would have been perfect for target practice at the time. But that's one of the local legends as well. That's inflicted a lot of damage on the house. Yeah, sure. I'm sure that's, as events unfold from July 1921 to December 1921 and the treaty negotiations, what impact on Carlow did the eventual treaty bring to the county? Well, I think Carlow was very eager and happy to get back to some semblance of normality after the incidents of the War of Independence. A few as they may have been, they had shocked the local community, and Carlow, as I say, was very adamant to get back to peace times, and it was the first county, in fact, in the whole country, through its county council, to call for the ratification of the treaty in December 1921. So this was before even counties like Clare or Cork, which had seen the most violence. Carlow was very reactionary, that when they heard there was a possibility of peace, the county council wanted to make known that they were in support of it, and they wanted to urge the local deputies to vote for the treaty. So that gives some indication of the fact that the appetite for war was completely non-existent in Carlow at that stage, within the community at large.
Okay. So what was the general attitude in Carlow after the Anglo-Irish Treaty had been ratified, in the context of what was happening in the rest of the country?
Yes, so there was general support for the treaty, and it was voted, it was supported throughout the county, and a lot of the old staff of the Carlow Brigade of the IRA supported the treaty, the vast majority of them. It was a popular move within the county, but that doesn't say that the Civil War had no impact in Carlow, that there was a lot of activity within Carlow on a local level, much of it under the guise of republicanism, but it had more agrarian and land issues came into play, and a lot of vicious small level attacks and burnings and household raids and robberies took place within Carlow, which I think would surprise a lot of people when you see the level of intimidation and attacks. And even if you take the case of big house burnings, I mean, no big house was burnt in Carlow during the War of Independence, and yet 3 were burnt during the Civil War. Okay. So something like that will give some indication of the level of activity within Carlow during the Civil War period.
Okay. I suppose, in terms of the Irish Civil War, we conclude on that note, and thank you very much for your insights. It's very interesting, and we look forward to seeing the book. Thank you all for watching, and I hope that you can join us again for our next discussion commemorating Carlow during the decade of centenary. Thank you very much.